Great. Okay, good morning and welcome to the second of Energy UK's Power Talks. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. My name is Dara Vias and I am Chief Executive of Energy UK. This event is taking place in our office here in not in Finsbury Square, we're on Cannon Street in London. And we've got a live audience, and welcome to all of you who are joining us online. I'm really pleased to say that we've got the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng in here in the office with us. What we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions in the room, and I hope that this is going to be really interesting for everyone. So thanks so much for joining us. I think, Kwasi, I'm just going to introduce you a little bit and just talk about how interesting your career has been, because you were first appointed a minister in the Energy Department, which was then BASE, Business and Energy, in 2019, a Secretary of State at the start of 2021.
That's right.
Through to September 2022. And as we all know, it's a really, really quiet period for the industry and for the world. You were Chancellor at the height of the energy crisis. And that was a time where over £40 billion was spent on supporting households and businesses with energy prices. And we could focus on that. But also, you were a minister when this government and the the UK led the way by introducing legislation committing us to reaching net zero by 2050.
Yeah, so
lots and lots of big moments.
Yeah. That happened actually a month before I got into my job.
Sorry.
So that was one of the last things that Theresa May did when she was Prime Minister. And as I remember, it was at the end of June 2019. And then she left office sort of halfway in July, and Boris Johnson took over, I think, the 20th.
Yes.
And then I was appointed that day to be Minister of State. So it was literally a month, maybe 3 weeks before I became a
big
minister.
moments.
Yeah.
Big moments.
Yeah.
And you were appointed in the wake of that. You were in the department during some really seismic times.
That's right.
So if it's okay, I'd like to start with maybe just asking you about that. What was it like being sat around the cabinet table during some of those big moments?
It was pretty extraordinary. So, I mean, I'm a historian by background, so chronology is very important to me. And I was appointed in July 2019. And at that point, we just passed, as I said, the net zero bill. And it was totally uncontroversial. I mean, what was extraordinary, it was only, 6 years ago? But there was massive cross-party consensus. I don't remember, maybe a handful of people voted against it or were abstained. But there was generally a broad consensus that this was the right thing to do within the UK Parliament.
Yes.
And so once it had passed, I came in and I thought, well, my job as Minister of State is to try and make sure that we can actually implement policies that can deliver. It's an ambitious target, so we've got to try and deliver it. So that we were going along steadily, and there was, as I say, this consensus. There was, I remember coming in 2020, right at the beginning of 2020, thinking hydrogen, that was the next big thing. We had one person working in the hydrogen department. By the end of the year, by the end of 2020, we had 25.
Right.
But of course, the big exogenous thing that totally, changed the world, as it were, was of course the COVID pandemic. And I remember that vividly because our closest energy ally probably is Norway. If you're the energy minister, you spend a lot of time talking to Norwegian counterparts. And I was due to fly to Norway to see the people, as it were, in March 2020. And it was touch and go. We didn't know whether I could go because of the restrictions and all the rest of it. In the end, we decided I wasn't going to go because of the COVID lockdown. And that changed everything. I mean, and we can talk about this more later. But the big change was, of course, the fiscal response the governments had meant that their balance sheets essentially blew up. Yeah. And what the net zero, the energy transition needed was government support. The government isn't going to push the whole thing, but at the same time it needs to invest so that you can crowd in private investment. That was a well-established principle of the energy transition. And I'm afraid as budgets were squeezed, it became harder and harder for governments really to deliver on that side. I think it's still happening, but COVID was a big exogenous shock to our net zero path, or our path to net zero.
Yeah, no, I think that's so interesting. And do you think that the crisis that followed with the energy crisis and the rocketing of the wholesale gas price. And we were talking about that was in some part due to economies opening up again
That's
after
right.
COVID. What was it like leading during that period? Because obviously the government at the time spent billions, I think it was around 40 billion, supporting businesses and households.
There were different things happening here. So when the COVID crisis hit, particularly in Southeast Asia and China itself, economies went into full lockdown. So they were in lockdown from, let's say, beginning of 2020.
Yeah.
And then they started coming out of lockdown, more or less, about a year and a bit later, so the summer of 21. And of course, as they came out, there was huge demand for gas. Gas prices, if you look at the gas price at the beginning of 2020, I mean, it was rock bottom. You'd be amazed how cheap it was. And then, because of this demand, this pent-up demand essentially being unleashed in 2021, the gas price totally spiked. And we hadn't been investing in gas, so there was a constriction of supply. Demand went through the roof, and prices just were astronomical. And this is at the end of 2021. Now, the big pressure then was the price cap, because obviously we had to, the companies operated within a price cap, but the price of the gas they were getting in the market was way beyond that. So loads of these companies went bust.
Yeah.
And my job was essentially to come up to the House of Commons and essentially say nothing's happening here. And it was under control. But actually the system, I think, was incredibly resilient because, as off the top of my head, I think we probably had about 65 suppliers, something like that. And more than half of those hit the wall because the wholesale price was so much higher than the cap. And essentially the cap forced a lot of these guys out of business.
I mean, and arguably they weren't well capitalised then.
You're right.
So
I mean,
there was some regulatory failure, I think.
That's right.
Into
There was regulatory failure, and you're quite right to say that the ones that went to the wall, they were essentially like gas traders. They weren't. They didn't build in the resilience that they might have. They should have done maybe.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about energy is an essential service, and so the supplier of last resort, that system did work.
The solar worked. It definitely worked,
customers.
And it never became a political hot potato in the way that we thought it would. Now the prices, that's different with the price cap, but in terms of the suppliers going bust, that was something that the system dealt with, and actually I think it dealt with it well.
Yeah, sticking with the theme of, I agree. By the way, I think it did work well, and I think most people didn't experience.
No, they wouldn't have noticed.
They wouldn't have, and hopefully that's, it's credit to the industry and credit to Ofgem for running a good process there. Right. I think, but your point around the international impact, obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine also contributed to those increasing prices.
Yeah, yes.
And during your time as Chancellor, that moment where you signed off on the huge budget to help people.
Yeah, I think that was, looking back, because I don't know how closely you followed that debate, but there was, I think it was Keith Anderson from Scottish Power who was saying that, we should try and claim back the bills, the price, protection. And there was a debate within government. I think looking back, that was such a generous, package, and then you layer it on top with the tax cuts, then everything went haywire, as I remember. But yeah, there were huge interventions. But the Putin invasion was obviously had an effect on the price. But I think the real peak was at the end of 21, before the invasion. I think the big driver was this pent-up demand out of Asia, particularly, essentially just really trying to get gas.
I think you're right. Look, my view on that is actually the reality is we weren't then set up, and nor are we now set up to really target support. So it's the same thing were to happen again.
That's right.
We'd be in the same bind because we don't have enough information between the industry
Well,
and government.
Politically, it's very difficult.
Target support.
But because the schemes we looked at, I represented a seat in the southeast, which by national standards is very affluent.
Yes.
And I think the policy we looked at was, people earning less than 70,000 a year would get support. Let's say that was the figure. I think that was one of the figures. But of course, if you're in the southeast and a lot of your constituents are commuting, 70 grand a year, it's a lot, but it's not huge amounts of money. And particularly if you're spending money on living costs, on travel care, childcare, travel, then it didn't make sense to cut people off at that level. So from a political point of view, it was much easier just to help everybody and not draw these artificial lines.
I think it was the only choice that could have been made at the time.
At that time,
I do.
but it was hugely generous. With the gas price at the time, but of course the gas price fell, so the cost of the intervention was much less ultimately than had been anticipated.
I mean, well, we always talk about learning the lessons and being better set up to target some support next time, because I don't think we could,
But how would you do it? I mean, you could look at income levels.
Yeah.
But then, income levels is quite a broad brush.
We've got some ideas, and I'm going to bring them to
you.
you.
I'd be very interested to hear that. I'd be very interested to hear that.
I'm going to move us on. Just kind of, you began with talking about some of the global context.
Sure.
And I think that the UK balancing the points you've made around affordability, energy security, net zero, the trilemma keeps coming back. Do you think it's possible to deliver on all three?
It's very hard. So I always used to call it, because it's easier to remember, the SAS principle, security, affordability, sustainability, and those are the three things that you've described as the way to look at it. And for 3 years that was my life. I was thinking about it every day, and I think at the beginning we assumed that prices would be relatively low and contained. We also assumed that the government could fund a degree of de-risking of the decarbonisation story. So we were very much focused, I think, on sustainability. But as COVID hit, and as the war in Ukraine developed, the shift then was very much on security and affordability because of the price. So within those 3 years, we'd shifted, and I think there is always a tension between the three, because let's face it, as far as sustainability is concerned, governments and ultimately the taxpayer has to subsidise the crowding in of the private sector. The offshore wind industry didn't just develop, as a sort of act of God almost. It didn't develop spontaneously. It was actively encouraged by policy, and also by government committing, taxpayer pounds to driving that industry, and it's been hugely successful.
Yeah, and you were responsible for bringing in the annual auction.
Yes, so that was something that we did. I was very proud of, because the rationale, I used to go around a lot, and the supply chain would always say, well, we don't have visibility, because if it's every other year, it's a very lumpy demand.
Yes. Yeah.
So actually, the reason why the officials and myself thought actually an annual thing would work is because it's much smoother in terms of the demand, and they can plan more effectively.
Yeah.
And I think it's worked quite well. I mean, we dropped the ball a couple of times, but I think it was more sustainable and better than having it every other year.
And where do you think the UK is right now when it comes to the global comparison? Your points around crowding in investment from the private sector, they still ring true.
Actually that was one of the things that people from around the world. I remember talking to a Kenyan energy minister, which is a very different economy from ours, obviously, but they were all interested in how we managed through things like the offshore wind, the contract for difference, how we managed to actually spend money and actually get more investment in. And that was very much, when it came to budget in Bays, I definitely thought, for every pound we spent, we got to think how much more money we could attract. Yeah. That was always the Bays calculation, as it were, whether it was in the energy side, but also in the innovation and science side. So it was a very good department. And it could play a dynamic role in things like offshore wind and all that sort of thing.
It's certainly how we still think in the energy industry. It's about that partnership with government. It's for every pound of public sector money, how much do you unlock?
That's right.
At least £3, I hope, from the private sector.
Well, yeah, 3 is ambitious, but yeah. And that was and actually with the offshore wind, it was about 1 to 2.5 actually. So when I was minister, we'd spend about 100 billion over 10 years from 2012.
Yeah.
And about a third of that was government. If you broke it down, roughly a third was government, and 2/3 was private sector, which is 66 billion pounds over 10 years, which is and also it would have started much lower. So by the end, it was a huge amount of investment.
Tell us about some of your proudest achievements, because I feel like you're talking around some of them. What were you
I'm not.
the
annual auction. I think dealing with the energy. Price spike, the whole solar process, managing the liquidations like Bulb, which hit the wall, endless engagement through COVID, trying to make sure that the lights were on then.
I think you were having weekly meetings with my predecessors here.
Yeah,
at
weekly.
UK.
We talk. I mean, just holding hands through the COVID process. That I learnt a huge amount. And when I was Secretary of State after that initial process, I used to say to the junior ministers, people like Greg Hands, the only way you're going to learn about the industry is by talking to professionals. That's the best way. If you sit there and you're reading, submissions from civil servants, you're kind of at one remove from the actual industry.
Yeah.
And they're only writing the submissions because they've talked to people in the industry anyway.
Yeah.
So as a minister, you're better off just going to the source.
To the
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that you learn very quickly, and I was proud of this as well, was we were driving nuclear as well, so that came onto the agenda. I was lucky in that Boris Johnson, for all his idiosyncrasies, was very focused on net zero.
Yes.
And so we were very into nuclear. I wish we'd done more on that. And I hope the government is focused on it, because you can't get to net zero without some quite advanced serious nuclear provision supply. But yeah, there were all sorts of things that happened that I'm very, international engagement.
Yes.
So we did a deal with Qatar, on LNG. The Emir came to Downing Street and we signed a sort of MOU. There were lots of things we did. The Norwegian relationship was very good.
Let's stick with international agreement. Tell us a bit about COP26. Hosting COP is obviously a significant moment.
Yeah, it was. So the thing you got to remember about COP was that it was delayed a year because of the COVID. So we were all ready to go for 2020, which would have been interesting. But again, COVID put that back a year. And actually, for me, looking back, I think COP26, when was it? October 21?
That's it.
That was basically the high point, in the last few years of real consensus around the net zero agenda. I mean, I was there in Glasgow. We had people like, John Kerry from the US, Justin Trudeau, His Majesty the King, then Prince of Wales, took an active role in the events. We had obviously Alex Sharma, who was the president of the COP. We had, I think, Prince Albert of Monaco. I remember bumping into him, thinking, that was interesting. So there was a huge range of people, senior, politicians from across the world, and there was very much a consensus around, decarbonisation, around net zero, and 4 years on, we're in a very different place.
We are.
For a lot of the reasons I've described, and I think a lot of people who are very keen on net zero are slightly pessimistic and not as positive about it. And I think, but my view is that the strategic direction is still the same. It's just that, we get buffeted around. And I was looking at numbers, even in America, there's billions being invested in renewables, despite the rhetoric that's coming from the Trump regime.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really nice segue into the landscape of politics, really.
Sure.
I think it's changing so much, and if you look beyond government and you think about opposition parties, and of course your party as well, what role do you think opposition parties play in helping to shape some of this debate around long-term energy policy, as well as what we're doing here and now in terms of investments? Especially because, you've talked quite a bit about stability and cross-party consensus, and that's obviously fractured significantly. The conversation's quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, look, so, I'm a believer in democracy, and there's always, it's not like a market, it's not like, selling oranges or what have you, but there are similarities. Political parties essentially have to appeal to voters, and the danger with a consensus is that it's very easy for one party to say, actually, we don't agree with the consensus, and we're going to offer you something different. And then it drags a whole bunch of people to say, actually, this is what I want.
Yeah.
And that's just the nature of democracy. I think if you look at the climate change consensus, that lasted a very long time. So from the Climate Change Act in 2008 through the net zero legislation in 2019, and really through till, the big break, I think, was Rishi Sunak, when I can't remember which party conference it was, maybe he did one, so it was 2023 as leader, and they were starting to push back on a lot of that stuff. So that was 15 years from 2008 to about 22, 23, where there was, between the Labour and the Conservative Party, those were the two major parties, there was a lot of consensus. A lot of consensus. I mean, 2008 was before I came into the House of Commons, but only about 4 or 5 Conservatives had voted against the Climate Change Act. And you'll remember that was a 80% reduction. It wasn't quite net zero, but it was 80% reduction. Yeah. And so for 15 years, we had a lot of consensus. And I think on the back of that, we made a huge amount of progress, because all the stuff went through the House of Commons, the backing of the offshore wind, all of those things were more or less uncontroversial.
Yeah.
And we made some progress. There were things we didn't do. We should have done more on nuclear. There were other things that we might have done. But generally, there was a forward movement. Then I suppose, as a consequence of Ukraine and COVID, or COVID and Ukraine in that order, energy bills went bananas.
They did.
And you had a cost of living crisis. You had, which was driven by inflation, a lot of it related to COVID, either spending, dealing with the COVID, or pent-up demand, as I've said, suddenly coming through.
And then high energy prices then contributing further.
That's right, all of that. And you could see, you didn't have to be a political analyst of great sophistication to see that once the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis occurred, a lot of the consensus around net zero, the political consensus, was going to fracture. People were going to use, whoever it might be, were going to use the fact of the inflation, the fact of the cost of living, the fact of the energy crisis to say, well, hang on a second, if this is all of this is going on, why are we putting money into net zero, which is just burdening the consumer more? That was the argument. And we could say, look, it's not about that. It's about, and in the long term, you're going to save money. But those arguments were difficult to make. And, populist, dare I say, politicians were always going to use that. And you saw it in America. You've seen it around Europe as well.
Yes.
And we've seen it here. So the reform argument is very much along the lines I've described. There's a consensus. This is all, and that's part of their wider narrative. It's all a stitch up. They're all the same. They all, driving net zero and mass migration, and they jumble it all together. And they say, actually, we're going to make things a lot easier, and we're going to scrap net zero. But I mean, I was just talking to people earlier. The reality of them, let's say they come into government, they're not going to abolish all the jobs around net zero. They're not going to suddenly say, actually, all the, around the, in Hull and the Humber and, Newcastle and, Highnet in Cheshire. They're not going to suddenly say, actually, we're going to fire all these people because we're scrapping net zero. That's the reality of government. And I know people in reform, and I say that to them. I say, you're going to have to deal with reality. If you do get in, and I'm not sure they will, but if you do, you're going to have to deal with reality, and a lot of this rhetoric you won't be able to deliver on.
1 in 25 jobs is related to the energy industry in some way, and then these jobs are right across the country.
That's right.
They're not London.
And actually they're concentrated. I mean, that was one of the things I remember discussing with Boris when he was Prime Minister, was that a lot of those net zero energy jobs were concentrated in what used to be called, what he called the red wall. And if reform get in, they'll be well represented in the red wall.
Spaces.
So, the idea that they're going to come in and then zap all the jobs in their constituencies, if that's what happens, if they get in, I think is not realistic.
Yeah, I mean, look, delivering clean power means lots more jobs as well.
That's right.
And there are lots of different types of jobs. And one of the things we often talk about is that actually in our industry, we really need more entry-level jobs like welders. We need lots of that. And I think with this current government's agenda, with the approaching to building and construction generally, there's an awful lot more.
Well, yeah, I was very, that's one of the things I think this government, I did agree with, was that we had all these, votes, and because of the fragility of the majorities a lot of the time, we couldn't get through the building reforms that we needed to.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, the government is committed to that. We have to wait and see what happens. But that will create good entry-level, manufacturing style, construction style, industrial jobs to drive the decarbonisation.
And we've talked about reform, but we've obviously, since the last general election, seen a huge comeback for the Liberal Democrats as well.
That's right.
We've got 4 Green MPs now.
That's right.
Opposition in general, I think, is quite different to when it was when
it is very different. I mean, that's a broader, beyond the energy world. We grew up in a world where there was Labour Conservative, And even as late as 2017, but with the Corbyn election, something like 82% of the voters voted Labour or Conservative. That was 8 years ago. And last time, as I do the maths, it was about 57%, 33, 24, 34, 20, something like that, high 50s. Now, Conservative and Labour in the polls now is barely 40%. So, I mean, I don't know whether the election will reflect that. It could be different, but the world has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And the other 60% are across, Reform, Greens, Lib Dems, all sorts of people.
And across political parties, we see the challenge of how you put in place, certainly in our industry, this approach where you've got national equity, but you've also got local diversity.
Sure.
And we're on the cusp of huge change in energy with the introduction of regional energy spatial planning and strategic planning, more local area energy plans, community energy, moving to this more distributed system.
Sure.
I think really plays into that balance between national equity and local diversity. And I raise this because politically, I think there's a huge challenge for that not in my backyard approach when it comes to building.
Yeah, I think it's, and if you've got lots of parties, one of them will say, actually, we don't want anything to be built. Do you see what I mean? It becomes harder to do that sort of infrastructure. But at the same time, I think community energy is a really good opportunity. Because the problem with energy is that it's often very abstract.
Yes.
So people don't really get their heads around. It's complicated, it's big systems, it's big infrastructure. So I think if you can bring it down to a local level in any way, that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah.
So that people have more connectivity to the system, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I was always a supporter of it in government, and I think we should do more to develop it.
And sticking with that macro and micro.
Yeah.
During your time, obviously, we often talk about and celebrate, and it's worth celebrating the UK having led the way when it came to
it was great. It
decarbonisation.
was a good thing we did.
It's mostly done at the power generation level.
That's right.
And the challenge was for you and remains for this government how you deliver the next big tranche.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to belittle the power generation achievement.
No, it's huge.
It was enormous.
Significant.
And as a historian, we were digging out coal
Absolutely.
like crazy, even till the 80s. I remember reading something in the 1950s, which isn't that long ago. It's a long time ago, admittedly, but we
Scans the audience.
But in those days, and many of us grew up during the miners' strike and all of that sort of thing. So some of us have some memory of coal being a massive political and economic thing.
Remember,
But it was something like 1 million tons a day, in the 50s of coal. So to phase that out of the British energy system.
Yeah.
And essentially bring on renewables, I think is a historic achievement.
Yeah.
I really think that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people around the world were very impressed by that.
Yeah.
Because they could see, they all know about the Industrial Revolution, or they were taught about it, and they know that coal was a big part of it.
Yeah.
And so for the country that basically led the Industrial Revolution and was driven by coal, to have essentially removed coal from power generation, was notable.
Yeah, no, we're very proud. One of our members, Uniper, obviously closed the UK's last coal-fired power station. Around this time last year. Actually,
That's right, 24.
And it was a really moving occasion.
Yeah.
One of the big things I took away from it was the success of being able to the business kind of successfully worked with workers and unions to have a really fair transition. And it was a really positive story.
Yeah, so as in terms of the history of energy, that's massive. Coal drove everything for 200 years, and then we don't have any. So let's park that. But you're quite right to say that in other areas, particularly, and the biggest problem we had was in sort of insulation buildings. Getting people to, we had all these green deals, and none of that really took off. And that's been the consistent problem.
Yeah, I think it remains a problem.
Yeah, I think so.
Decarbonising heat, electrifying transport.
That's right. I think transport is somewhat easier, but it's that business, because the structure of, and I remember looking at this, the structure of ownership in terms of property.
Yes.
Roughly 7, these are broad brush figures, but roughly 70% own a house, either through a mortgage or they paid off the mortgage. And within that, it was about 50-50. So half the 70% had paid it off, half had a more existing mortgage. And you're essentially asking all of these people, and they don't have the cash. I mean, why would they? You've got to borrow, you might have to borrow more to insulate your house.
Yeah.
That's what it reduced to. And that's very difficult. It's a very difficult argument to make. It's very difficult to persuade people that that's the right thing to do. And of course, if the government steps in, that requires huge public expenditure. But at the same time, you've got COVID expenditure to pay for, taxes are going up.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it remains tricky, but I do think there are options. And I think what's been really interesting for me in the last few years is seeing how this government has picked up some of the policies of the former government when it came to boiler upgrade scheme grants and things
That's
like
right.
that.
But there was a variation of,
Yeah.
but ultimately the fundamental problem still is the same. You've got people who are indebted in terms of having bought houses or they've cleared their debt. And essentially they're going to have to borrow more at some level to insulate the house.
Yeah.
And persuading people to do that is hard.
I think it's cost, it's disruption, it's fear of
All of
cowboy
that, people coming into your house.
Yeah.
If you're elderly and you don't want someone traipsing in your house doing something you're not quite sure what the point is.
Yeah.
So, but this is a perennial problem, and we've had so many different schemes over the years.
And we certainly see sort of heat pumps, heat networks, that decarbonisation of heat from an industry perspective. For us, it's crucial. And getting that transition and customer protection right is going to be really important.
But talking specifically about the UK, I mean, I can step back now, so I'm not in the government. I don't need to
Feel free.
defend. So the one thing I noticed was that our housing stock is so diverse.
So diverse.
Okay, so there are, people live in little cottages in the country. People live in, big estates in urban areas. People live in terraced houses, semi-detached, detached. And a housing stock that's, probably the oldest in Western Europe. Yes. There are houses that are 18th century houses, there are houses. So the point with that diversity is it's never going to be a one size fits all. So when I was, even as a minister, when they said, we're going to have like a gazillion heat pumps, I was like, really? For some properties, heat pumps are brilliant. But there are other things. If you look at housing, there are all sorts of networks that you can use. Based around water, all sorts of things that can heat, a block of flats
the heat
much more effectively. The heat networks, all of that, much more effectively. And I just think that the way that governments look at this is way too simplistic. If we make a billion heat or whatever, X amount of heat pumps, everything will be okay. But they're not looking at the specific needs of the houses.
Comes back down to that national local angle.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Locally.
But when we looked at this, I mean, that was the thing. Those are the facts that really struck me: the diversity, and also the age of the. People live in very old houses. You speak to American friends. There isn't a house. There are no houses over 100 years old in America. Well, very few. Whereas in Britain, there are lots and lots of old houses, which are difficult to insulate and make more energy efficient. And
you made the point around sort of older people as well.
That's right.
It is another part of that housing jigsaw puzzle, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I grew up in northwest London, and there were houses there. There was a huge, many people will know this, there was a huge housing drive in the 30s. So you go around a lot of suburban Britain. Are those, brick, houses. And up to very recently, the people who'd originally bought them were still living there. I mean, I knew people like this. And the idea that they were going to get some guy to come in and, put a heat pump or whatever, it just wasn't going to happen. And then even now, a lot of their kids live there. So it's a difficult nut to crack.
I think there's lots of things we could do. I do think one of the issues we've got is that we've still got really high electricity prices.
That's right.
If we could do something about rebalancing where policy costs sit, then actually making electrification
attractive. I've got thoughts on that. Look, so the main thing. So if I wind the clock back 5 years, and energy prices were quite low comparatively to where they are now. The biggest issue we had in politics was the fact that our manufacturing, the electricity energy costs for industry, were way higher than for consumers, individual consumers. And that was politically very difficult. And so all the rebalancing was all about that. But of course, even then, we weren't prepared to increase the prices on consumers effectively, essentially to subsidize industry. And I think, from a energy cost point of view, that conversation was always led by industry at the beginning. And now it's both. Now both sides. And of course, going back to the populist argument is that, well, this is all down to net zero. And I don't think it is, actually. There are lots of reasons why power costs are very high.
Yeah, you're right. Look, business costs are really high, so are household costs. And that,
Sure.
That balance between kind of making sure we're investing long term in infrastructure is always going to be really crucial, isn't it? And we have to do that fairly.
Yeah.
You could argue some of the policy costs perhaps are more regressive being put on the bills.
Sure.
But it's been a challenge for a while.
It
And I
has.
think for this government, having made such a big commitment on reducing bills and also investing in clean power, as you say, it's a really difficult nut to
It's
crack.
very hard. So one of the things that I wasn't responsible for it, but I think it was a mistake looking back is, the EPL, the Energy Profits Levy, in terms of the North Sea. And you get different arguments about this, but I think, that's something which people say, rightly or wrongly, that, this is a national resource and we should be encouraging people to exploit it, and that somehow that will bring down costs. I think that's too simplistic an argument, but you can see that there is a force to it, and I don't think that was joined up. I think because you see the way in which government looks at it is that, well, renewables are good, fossil fuels are bad. If you invest in renewables, that's good. If you invest in fossil fuels, that's bad. But in the real world, it's the same people investing in both.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? It's not like they're sheep and goats. They're all doing the same thing, both things.
Yeah.
And so that was something I don't think we appreciated enough.
Yeah, and the kind of the links to the fact that we will still remain quite reliant on imports, even if you granted
That's
all
right.
the
That's right.
all the new. All
That's
the
right. So if you look at it in the
potential
macro
licenses,
round, it's much better to have your own gas than import it from halfway around the world.
Energy security is a huge theme, I think.
It is, and it's something, again, talking about the history that from 2019. It really came sharply into focus after 22 with the Ukraine thing. Before that, we weren't really, obviously we took it for granted. And in those days, 50% of the gas came from the North Sea. I think in 2020, that was something like 50%. So we weren't really that exercised by it.
Yeah. I'm going to move us on to a kind of a more personal question, if that's okay. You are no longer in Parliament, and if you were giving advice to and one of the new cohort of MPs, what would be your top tips?
Well, I think they've got to work out what they're interested in, because you can't cover all the policy areas, and there are votes all the time in the House of Commons. I mean, I remember one MP when we came in 2010. He said, "I'm going to make sure I know everything that I'm going to vote for," and that lasted a month, because there's so much going on. So they've got to focus on their things. And then actually, I think with the energy, it's not super technical, but there are little details that you have to kind of get your head around. And it's not for everyone. But if you are committed to it, it's an extremely interesting, probably the most interesting policy areas. And traditionally it was less political. That was one of the interesting things about it.
Yeah.
They were pragmatic problems that you could come to the same conclusions from different political. It didn't matter what your political views were. Energy security looks a certain thing. Decarbonisation is do you see what I mean? You have to act and think about very similar things. Even if you're a Marxist or an ultra-capitalist or whatever, a lot of the practical problems have to be dealt with in a certain way.
And any advice you'd give them on how to handle the curveballs, because you certainly had to weather things that you never expected.
This is one of the things that I regret about when I was in the Treasury, was that you've got to be very calm. You've got to have a really, and it's so unfashionable. But I remember this. I mean, some of you will know. There's what's it called? If you can keep your head, all that sort of stuff. It's exactly. I remember reading that, thinking that is the best advice.
Yes,
and I know it's very gendered because it says at the end, "You'll be a man, my son." I can't read it to my daughters, But a lot of the stuff he talks about applies 100% to politics.
Yeah.
You got to be quite strategic. You got to be very calm. You got to be able to just think strategically and not be buffeted around too much. And that's why I think with regard to net zero, my fear is that people are going to say crazy things and we're going to scrap it. It's going to be over. And then it's like you've done all this work for 15 years, and you're saying actually that's it. That's not serious.
I mean, that's also great advice for my industry, so thank you.
Yeah, because they get you do. I mean, that's human nature.
Yeah,
you get butted around, and that's right.
Yeah.
But you just got to keep the and all of these things, they kind of work themselves out, I think.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm going to go to questions in the room, if that's okay. We're going to use the microphone.
Yeah, it's for those online, so you won't hear me in the room, but please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kwasi, for a really interesting...
I'm so sorry, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. Oh. Sorry, technical issues. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself as well, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Katie. I'm from Utility Warehouse.
Oh, great. I know that.
Thank you for a really interesting discussion so far. You've mentioned that you're a historian, so I wanted to ask you, what lessons do you think haven't yet been learnt from the past and your experience in the energy market?
I don't have the time, but I would love to write, if I had lots of time, a history of the last 50 years of failed energy policy. I mean, that's a huge book, right? Because there are so many things. I remember reading Nigel Lawson, famous chancellor. He was also an energy minister, and he was very anti-nuclear, and that was because we basically got the North Sea, and so they thought, well, this is a bonanza. It's wonderful. We can just harvest the North Sea from an energy point of view. But I think, and so strategically, we rode back from nuclear, and I think that was a huge mistake. Because again, looking back at the 50s and 60s, we were the top civil nuclear country. And that was something we abandoned. And we're still playing catch up on that. So whenever we talked about nuclear, we went to Korea, we spoke to Americans, Chinese, French, Koreans, basically. The Russians do it, but for obvious reasons, we're not going to engage them on that. But we had our own industry that we should have nurtured all over that time. And we still do, but I think we were in a better place. So I think we've got to be much more strategic as a country, particularly in regard to energy. And other countries do it. I mean, the French were committed to, obviously they didn't have the North Sea, but they were committed to nuclear, and they stuck to that. And they built, quite a sophisticated nuclear industry. So I think strategic focus has got to override, short-term tactical considerations. But I'm afraid the nature of our politics is very much the other way. And that's the tension.
Yeah, there's a disconnect for us as well, because investments in energy often have sort of 10, 15,
that's right.
30-year investment horizons. And
that's right.
Compared to a 5-year political cycle, that really
yeah, and then we do. I mean, I remember. Nick Clegg. I remember him saying, I was a backbencher, and I was saying, "What about nuclear?" And he said, "Oh, we can't do that. I mean, if we decide now, it'll be 2022 before the nuclear." And I'm like, "Yeah, 2022. That's good, right?" Of course, it's going to take time, but in the end, you've got to, it's that Chinese, I don't know whether it's Chinese, but it says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now.
Yes.
Just because it takes a long time doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
That's right. Question.
Hi, Kwasi. Ben Cook at the Times here. I just wanted to ask you about fracking. Obviously, you were in Johnson's government when the moratorium was imposed, and then in Truss's government when she tried to restart it. Now, both your own party and Reform would like to restart it. And I was just wondering if you have any advice to them, given what happened under Truss, about, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing politically, whether there is a way to make it work.
It's very good that you mentioned that, because technically, when she brought the fracking thing, when there was the vote, I'd been sacked at that point. So I was sacked on the Friday, the 14th, and then they brought the fracking vote on the Monday or Tuesday, and then she resigned on the Thursday. I think the vote was on the Wednesday. So technically, I wasn't in the government when they brought it in, and it's a very minor point. But actually, with the Johnson government, we announced the moratorium about 2 months before the election. and politically, I just don't think it could fly. Now, ideologically, lots of people in my party and Reform were committed to fracking because it's cheap energy. But the problem, and I saw this, we did an afternoon on it, we looked at the population densities. And if you go to somewhere like Wyoming or even Texas is probably 10 people a square kilometre. Wyoming was 2. And we were suggesting doing it in Lancashire, where the population density was 493 people per square kilometre. So you can see if you've got a country or a piece of land where there are 1 or 2 people per square kilometre,
Yes.
fracking is going to be a lot less politically controversial than a part of the country where there are 400, nearly 500 people living a square kilometre. And that was the problem we had with the fracking. So ideologically, I'm not against it, but I think practically and politically, it was very difficult to push. And the only way you could have done it is if you compensated the people, like the French do this. You just compensated the people who live there and said something like, you can have free energy for 30 years or for life or whatever. But I don't think we hadn't advanced those conversations, and they would have been conversations that the Treasury would have been, very much involved in. So I just don't think we've got the package of measures really to make fracking politically deliverable.
There's lots of outstanding questions about geology as well, aren't there?
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Susan in the blue.
Thank you, Kazi and Dara. Susan McDonald from Deloitte, but I'm asking with my trustee of the Women's Engineering Society. So I think you shared that you've got daughters, I've got a daughter, and when we look at what we need in the energy industry, the importance is obviously around multiple disciplinary skills, including policy, but core is also science and engineering and technicians. And we look at the diversity of our pipeline. We have less than 16% of females in engineering. We're losing them at quite an alarming rate. So you touched a little bit around systems thinking and kind of policy integration. I just wanted to kind of hear from you your perspectives of how do we get more cross-departmental focus and power, pun intended, to really think about how do we accelerate that diversity of pipeline of talent that we so desperately need to both accelerate but realise our ambitions for net zero.
I think, diversity of workforce aside, diversity of skills, there is a real problem in Whitehall in terms of working across departments. And that again is from the history, they were all, the departments develop very piecemeal. And they're very much, there's a Secretary of State who kind of runs it and that reports, and it's not, they don't work together across the same thing. So, on some, let's take the example of women in engineering or women in the energy industry. There are lots of stakeholders there. There's, from a government point of view, you've got BEIS, you've got Treasury, which is in everything, obviously. You've got education. You've got probably the Home Office in terms of immigration and all that sort of thing. But it's very, very difficult to coordinate those departments in that line. What I would say about the specifics of women in STEM, I think we've done a lot of work on this, actually. We've done a lot of work. Obviously there's a long way to go. But I'm a certain age. I've got a friend, and she was at Camborne School of Mines. And there were 200 undergraduates in a class. And there were 4, she was one of 4 women. And that was whenever it was, the 90s. She's my age, so it was sort of mid-90s. I think we've moved a long way, but there's still a lot more to do. Now, who is responsible for that? I think the education department is critical, because you're learning those skills, at a young age. You're learning, maths and physics and chemistry, at a very young age, and you've got to encourage people to be doing that at A level. That's where I think a lot of that happens.
Definitely a role for government. There's also a role for industry. I
Yeah,
think,
definitely.
I
it's
still
not just
walk
all.
into meetings where
Yeah,
I'm the
agree.
only woman. So yeah, I think.
But they
it's
will say to you that
absolutely-
it's about the pipeline. But you're right. There's a kind of culture issue,
It's a cultural issue.
and I think we need to address that.
Yeah, and we do an awful lot at Energy UK to work with our members and across the industry
Sure.
on how we improve those sorts of things. But it is about partnership, and so much I think of what we've talked about has been about the partnership
Definitely.
between government.
I mean, that's one of the things I learned. I've said this publicly. I mean, you learn. There's no industry in the country or in the world, I think, that where the relationship between government and the private sector is so important. You know, there's certain industries where you know you can do those jobs and not really engage with government. And there are other industries which are just purely government. Some, but in energy, it's got to be a dance between the two.
Yeah. Go to Rachel at the back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Rachel from the Financial Times. I just wondered if you could say a bit more about what you would have done differently with hindsight during the energy crisis, and what was it that stopped you from doing that?
I think we did. So there were two aspects of the crisis. One was the supplier crisis, which I think worked very well. So even though, and we discussed this earlier, and that was really at the end of 2021, where lots and lots of these companies, the suppliers, were essentially called out by the price cap because they were forced to buy very high energy at very high prices in the retail, but of course the price cap meant that they couldn't pass that through, and they weren't capitalised, and they weren't robust. And we created the supply of last resort, which had been established before, which really picked up and redistributed the customers.
We tested a process.
That's right, and it was very robust actually, looking back. And I think in terms of the energy intervention, that's when Liz Truss became Prime Minister and we announced this energy intervention. There was a whole debate during that summer about whether we could claw back some of the intervention. And if we'd done that properly, it would have been scored at zero. And so the whole issue in terms of the balance sheet would have been different. So that's a debate actually that happened at the time. But hindsight's a beautiful thing. I mean, to be fair, there was an insistent demand to do something about this. And it might not have worked if we'd said, oh, well, we'll claw back the intervention over 10 years or 20 years. That might not have worked politically.
Yeah, I think it's important to. We're going to go to Andrew.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Andrew from Scottish Power. So for for 3 decades I've been in this industry, and like you, I lived through the crisis, and it was we're probably still up at 1 a.m. Different houses, obviously. We're probably still up at 1 a.m. dealing with it. I'm interested just to follow on from the question earlier about hindsight and what lessons we've learned. So, I'm really interested in your insight as to why we're not taking or have taken certain decisions on the backdrop of a market that collapsed. And yet we have one of the largest energy companies and 2 other energy companies sitting here today, that still have not sufficiently covered their capital. And yet if the energy price spikes, are we then going to see millions of customers actually without an energy company? And then secondly, this morning Ofgem announced that they want us to, now as suppliers, they want us to offer a low or possibly no standing charge. And for me, that is just another step to destabilising the retail energy market, because you understand very well the recovery mechanism from investment decisions that were taken 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And that's what we are. So I'm keen, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's about someone's bill, a household bill. And there are people in this country who cannot afford to pay for their energy bills. But I'm just interested why, from your insight, government and the regulators seem unable to just really clinically solve a problem that's been around for at least a decade.
There's different dynamics. I mean, I don't know the specifics of what you're talking about, so I'm just, saying, I haven't been that close to the industry for 2 or 3 years. I mean, I follow what's going on, but I don't know what the specifics are, what you're talking about. But broadly, there was always a tension between, having a really competitive supply, system, suppliers, and then if you're going to have them being really competitive, then why would you put capital restrictions on them? But of course that makes the thing more vulnerable. So there was a sort of jumble of incentives. And you'll remember that the reason why we had this price cap, which I was amazed at, I mean, I was a backbencher when we introduced it, and I thought, what are we doing this for? But the rationale was that the perception was that there was a very oligopolistic cartel of companies. And so we thought if we put a price cap, that basically forces them to they're not able to charge the earth, and it allows other people to come in and set up and it was almost too successful because we had at one point about 65 or 70 companies who were suppliers. And then the rationale behind that is that you wanted a low barrier to entry. So why would you, if you want a low barrier to entry, have a whole bunch of capital balance sheet requirements for these firms? But of course, what happened. So as a consequence of that, these companies were not well capitalized. They were, they were bad actors in many cases, I think. And so when the price shot up, they were wiped out. But there's this balance. Obviously, if you put massive capital restrictions, you're creating a very high fence and you're creating barriers to entry and you're going back to the oligopolistic structure that you had before. But of course, if you lower that fence, then a whole bunch of people will come in and some of them won't necessarily be very disciplined. So from a government point of view, it's quite a difficult balance to strike. And I've been there, but I get your point, totally. And I think that one of the problems with it is that energy is very non-political until it isn't. You see what I mean? Or it's like it can move along,
Yes.
but then all of a sudden there's a crisis and everyone's blaming fat cats, the government, this, and we get very reactive. And a lot of the policies we've done, I think particularly, I mentioned the EPL, were responding to populist concern, popular concerns, let's say, not populist. And then we knee-jerk into policy. And I don't think that's good. But I can see why people do it.
Yeah, we had the energy generator levy as well, so it was across the system.
Well, that's more recent though, wasn't it?
So at the same time as the EPL,
Yeah,
it
that's
was
right.
for the merchant.
That's right,
renewables.
that's
So,
right, that's
yeah,
right.
I mean, it's intervention across the system, wasn't there?
And I think, and also because people don't really get the market mechanism. So when things are going well, they see massive profits and they think we've got to tax those profits. But when things are going badly, no one's saying, "Oh, we should subsidise the firms." It's kind of heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing.
And the diversity of our industry means that we've always got lots of trade-offs in the winners and losers across the space.
But there's always going to be that tension.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question if we can. I'm going to look at this side of the room just because I haven't taken many from this side.
Yeah, they're all coming from that side. Well, there are fewer people on this side.
Hi, Sam Hall from the Conservative Environment Network. You talked a lot, Kwasi, in your talk about the link, or the importance rather, of private sector and government partnership in the energy markets. And obviously at the moment we talked about the sort of fracturing cross-party consensus on climate. And I think one of the reasons for scepticism on the right has been a sort of growing suspicion and distrust and dislike of that state intervention. Now you're obviously a free market conservative. How have you reconciled your kind of free market views with your views on energy policy, and what's your kind of advice on how we can convince more on the centre-right to accept some limited intervention in this space?
It's good to revert back to what I call the SAS principle. And I only call it that because it's easy to remember. Security, affordability, and sustainability. Now with sustainability, you can get free market solutions, but the whole problem with it, if you buy into that narrative, is that the economy, the capitalist system, whatever you want to call it, and I'm a big supporter of that, has somehow failed in terms of the sustainability argument. So you've got sustainability in itself brings in government. And as we've seen in the UK with offshore wind take up, there had to be some government sort of expenditure to get the ball rolling. And when you look at affordability, when prices go crazy, there's a huge cry for the government to intervene. And it does intervene. Now we can have a philosophical debate whether it should or shouldn't, but the political reality is that you have to step in. And again, security, a lot of that is government policy. I mean, I know projects that have essentially been killed because there's a security of supply issue, not because of the economics. So across all those three metrics, you can see it, government has a role to play. And the problem with being in government is that when things are fine, no one cares. But if there's let's say there's a security of supply issue, the first person that gets blamed is the government. When things are fine, no one cares. It's great. This is the free market. It's brilliant. And then all of a sudden, when it doesn't work, the government's the one who gets blamed. So there's always going to be some role for government in an energy space, and you see it in other walks of life as well. I mean, finance. When the banks are free market, but then of course when they blow up, the first thing they do is come to government. So even if you're a right wing or left, whatever, you've got to be prepared perhaps to do something, because there's a political expectation that you should do something.
Thank you so much. Right, I've still got so much on my list for
we could have
AI,
talked
data
about other things.
centres,
We could have
hydrogen.
talked. We didn't even mention hydrogen. I'd mentioned hydrogen
we
once.
didn't mention CCS. With so many things we could have talked about. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you so much for joining us online. You should be able to see a link to our annual conference, which is on October 14th. We've also got our Young Energy Professional Awards happening on the 6th of November, and tickets are selling fast for both. So if you are interested, get in quick. My thanks to everybody in the room and online, and particularly to my team who've made sure that this has all run so smoothly, and of course to Gary, Ruben and Ray who've been on our cameras and mics. So thank you all for coming.